It was the spring of 1931, a time when the Great Depression cast a long shadow over America. The country was struggling, and the South was no exception. In the small town of Scottsboro, Alabama, the air was thick with tension and uncertainty. Racial divisions ran deep, and the economic hardships only exacerbated the existing prejudices. On a chilly March day, a group of 9 black teenagers, ages 13 to 19, boarded a freight train, hoping to find work in the nearby city of Chattanooga. They were filled with youthful optimism, dreaming of better opportunities and a brighter future. Among them were boys like Haywood Patterson, who had aspirations of becoming a boxer, and Charlie Weems, who wanted to help his family escape poverty. As the train rattled along the tracks, the boys laughed and shared stories, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. When the train stopped in Scottsboro, they were approached by 2 white women, Ruby Bates and Victoria Price, who claimed they had been thrown off another train. The boys, feeling a sense of camaraderie, offered to help the women, and they all climbed aboard the freight train together. However, the atmosphere shifted dramatically when the train was stopped by local law enforcement. The 2 women accused the boys of rape, claiming they had attacked them while on the train. Panic ensued as the sheriff and a group of white men descended upon the scene, fueled by a mix of racial animosity and a desire for swift justice. The boys were arrested and taken to the local jail, where they were held in cramped, unsanitary conditions. News of the alleged crime spread like wildfire through the town, igniting a frenzy of outrage and calls for retribution. The boys, terrified and confused, were thrust into a nightmare they could not comprehend. In the days that followed, the town of Scottsboro became a battleground of racial tension. White residents rallied around the accusers, demanding justice for what they believed was a heinous crime. The boys, on the other hand, were seen as guilty before they even had a chance to defend themselves. As the media caught wind of a story, sensational headlines painted the boys as dangerous criminals, further fueling the flames of racial hatred. The boys' families, desperate and powerless, watched as their sons were vilified in the press and subjected to the scorn of the community. In the midst of this chaos, the boys remained resolute, clinging to the hope that the truth would eventually prevail. Little did they know that their fight for justice would become a pivotal moment in the struggle against racial injustice in America. As the sun set over Scottsboro, the boys sat in their cells, grappling with fear and uncertainty. They were about to face a trial that would not only determine their fates, but also expose the deep-seated racism that plagued the American judicial system. The stage was set for a battle that would echo through history as the Scottsboro boys prepared to fight for their innocence in a world that had already condemned them. As the sun rose on the morning of April 6, 1931, the small town of Scottsboro was abuzz with anticipation. The courthouse, a modest brick building, became the epicenter of a national spectacle. Crowds gathered outside, a mix of curious onlookers, local residents, and reporters eager to cover the unfolding drama. The atmosphere was charged with tension as the fate of 9 young boys hung in the balance. Inside the courtroom, the boys were seated at a long table, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. They were dressed in ill-fitting clothes, a stark contrast to the well-tailored suits of the white men who filled the jury box. The all-white jury, composed of local men, was a reflection of the systemic racism that permeated the South. The boys' defense attorney, a man named Samuel Leibovitz, was a Jewish lawyer from New York who had taken on the case pro bono, recognizing the broader implications of the trial. The prosecution, led by the local district attorney, painted a vivid and inflammatory picture of the events that allegedly transpired on the train. Ruby Bates and Victoria Price took the stand, their testimonies filled with dramatic flair. They described a brutal assault, their voices trembling with feigned terror. The courtroom was captivated, and the jury listened intently, swayed by the emotional weight of their words. However, the defense was determined to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. Leibovitz cross-examined the women, exposing inconsistencies in their stories. He pointed out that the women had initially claimed they were attacked by a group of white men before changing their story to implicate the black teenagers. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the defense began to chip away at the prosecution's case. One by one, the Scottsboro boys took the stand, their voices trembling but resolute. Haywood Patterson, the most outspoken of the group, recounted the events of that fateful day. He spoke of camaraderie and kindness, emphasizing that they had offered help to the women, not harm. His testimony was heartfelt, and for a moment, the jury seemed to waver. Clarence Norris, another boy, shared his own account, detailing how they had been railroaded into this nightmare. The boys' testimonies were powerful, yet they were met with skepticism from the jury, who had already been influenced by the prevailing racial prejudices of the time. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as the boys' words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the weight of societal bias. As the trial progressed, the media frenzy surrounding the case intensified. Newspapers across the country published sensational headlines, framing the boys as dangerous criminals. The coverage was rife with racial stereotypes, depicting the boys as savages who posed a threat to white womanhood. This narrative not only fueled public outrage but also influenced the jury's perception, creating an environment where justice seemed increasingly elusive. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the International Labor Defense, began to rally support for the boys. They recognized the trial as a pivotal moment in the fight against racial injustice and mobilized resources to ensure the boys received a fair defense. Activists organized protests and raised awareness, drawing attention to the systemic racism that permeated the judicial system. After a tumultuous trial that lasted just a few days, the jury deliberated. The boys sat in anxious silence, their hearts pounding as they awaited the verdict. On April 9, 1931, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for all 9 boys, sentencing them to death. The courtroom erupted in chaos, with the boys' families weeping and the crowd outside cheering in a twisted celebration of what they believed was justice. The verdict sent shockwaves through the nation. It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated racism that plagued the American South and the urgent need for reform. The Scottsboro boys were not just victims of a flawed legal system, they had become symbols of a broader struggle for civil rights and justice. As the boys were led away in handcuffs, their spirits were crushed but not broken. They had faced a trial that was anything but fair, yet they remained determined to fight for their innocence. The battle was far from over, and the Scottsboro boys would soon find themselves at the center of a legal fight that would challenge the very foundations of racial injustice in America. The stage was set for a series of appeals that would reverberate through the courts and ignite a movement for change. In the wake of the shocking verdict, the Scottsboro boys were thrust into a new reality. The weight of their sentences hung heavily over them as they were transported to the notorious Kilby Prison, where they would await their fate. The conditions were grim. The boys were confined to small, dark cells, surrounded by the sounds of despair and hopelessness. Yet, amidst the bleakness, they found solace in each other, forming a bond that would sustain them through the darkest days ahead. News of the boys' convictions spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the nation. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the International Labor Defense, ILD, mobilized to support the Scottsboro boys. Activists organized rallies, wrote letters, and raised funds to ensure that the boys received competent legal representation. The case became a rallying cry for those fighting against racial injustice, drawing attention to the systemic failures of the judicial system. Prominent figures, including renowned attorney Clarence Darrow, expressed their willingness to help. Darrow, known for his defense of the underdog, recognized the significance of the case and the potential it had to challenge the status quo. His involvement brought renewed hope to the boys and their families, who had been left feeling abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. As the legal battle continued, the defense team filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the boys had been denied their right to a fair trial. The case, known as Powell v. Alabama, would become a landmark decision in American legal history. The defense contended that the boys had not been provided with adequate legal counsel, a violation of their rights under the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and the nation held its breath as the justices deliberated. The stakes were high. A ruling in favor of the boys could set a precedent for future cases involving racial injustice. The courtroom was filled with tension as the justices weighed the evidence, and the boys' fate hung in the balance. On November 7, 1932, the Supreme Court delivered its ruling. In a 7-2 decision, the court overturned the convictions of the Scottsboro boys, declaring that their right to counsel had been violated. The The justices emphasized that the boys had been denied a fair trial due to the systemic racism that permeated the judicial process. The ruling was a monumental victory for the defense and a significant step forward in the fight for civil rights. The news of the decision reverberated across the country, igniting celebrations among supporters of the Scottsboro Boys. However, the victory was bittersweet. While the boys had won the right to a new trial, they remained imprisoned, and the fight for their innocence was far from over. With the Supreme Court's ruling, the stage was set for a series of new trials. The boys were once again thrust into the spotlight, and the media frenzy surrounding their case intensified. The prosecution, determined to secure convictions, prepared to present a new case against the boys, but the defense was equally resolute in their commitment to prove their innocence. As the new trials commenced, the boys faced a familiar courtroom filled with the same racial biases and prejudices that had plagued their initial proceedings. The defense team, now bolstered by the support of civil rights organizations, worked tirelessly to dismantle the prosecution's case. They called witnesses, presented evidence, and challenged the credibility of the accusers, all while navigating the treacherous waters of a racially charged environment. As the new trials unfolded, the Scottsboro Boys remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. They had endured unimaginable hardships, yet their spirits remained unbroken. The fight for their innocence had become a symbol of the broader struggle against racial injustice in America, and the boys were determined to see it through to the end. With each passing day, they grew more resolute, knowing that their battle was not just for their own freedom, but for the countless others who had suffered under a flawed system. The stage was set for a final showdown in the courtroom, where the truth would be put to the test once more. As the new trials progressed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The boys, now young men, faced the same all-white juries that had condemned them before. The defense team, led by Samuel Leibovitz, fought valiantly to present a case that highlighted the inconsistencies in the testimonies of Ruby Bates and Victoria Price. They argued that the boys were innocent victims of a racially biased system, and the evidence presented was insufficient to support the charges. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the juries returned with their verdicts. The results were mixed. Some of the boys were acquitted,